this is one of the webinar series, so not in particular order, but this is actually one of the, I believe, one of the most important topics that any investigator would have to address before they embark on their research project. So I would start off with a quote by Phil Vernon, who says, "He who does not know what he's looking for will not lay hold of what he has found when he gets it." So you go figure out why I use this quote. So sometimes what happens is if you're actually mining data and you find out some results, you actually may get confused about your findings yourself. So as you all know, the University of Michigan, the Center for International Reproductive and Training at the University of Michigan has an overall research goal, which is to inspire research culture at individual and institutional levels. So this figure actually shows the framework that CIRHT uses, which is a research life cycle. As you can see in this figure, the number one research process in the life cycle is actually framing a research question. And we hope that the subsequent additional webinars will also cover the other aspects of the research process. So the research process in general would involve framing a research question, and then based on that, doing the study plan, and then finally actually conducting the actual study. In this webinar, we'll try to illustrate the importance of framing a good research question by asking useful, answerable, valid question, and we'll try to introduce two useful frameworks for evaluating and defining a research question. By doing this, by looking at these two parameters, this endeavor will actually help investigators develop valid and feasible study plans. So I would like you to concentrate on these two aspects, the valid and the feasible aspects. There is actually a tenuous balance between these two factors. And so by being able to develop this valid and study plan, these are actually the first processes that are important in submitting an IRB application and subsequently in grant application. I would like to mention that we only have a couple of minutes, like around 40 minutes to go over this, so we'll not be covering details about study design or statistics. We'll cover a little bit about the definition of what a research is, what a research question is, why we actually harp on saying we need to frame a research question, and some of the sorts of research questions. Characteristics of a good research question. For that, we'll use the final criteria, and we will also be using a roadmap for framing a research question using a PICOT framework. We'll try to illustrate with some examples and provide some resources. So to start off, for this particular webinar, we're defining research as the one on 45 CFR 46 that Olivier knows about, the Code of Federal Regulations. Research means, so I'm gonna use like a defined verbatim. Research means a systematic investigation, including research development, testing, and evaluation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. I would like to point out that there is actually a need to make a distinction between what a clinical research is and then a clinical practice, because sometimes they actually get mixed up. So somebody may actually be, there may be a study drug, an investigation drug that a person who's failing, like let's say, on a cancer therapy, it may be involved with that. But the objective of that is actually not to generalize knowledge, but it's actually to better the patients. So some things that actually look like research are not research. So research has this aspect because it's designed to test actually a hypothesis, and then using the scientific method, test a hypothesis and permit conclusions, thereby contribute to generalizable knowledge in terms of theories, principles, statements, and then relationships between different variables. And so what is a research question? So the research question is the uncertainty that the investigator wants to resolve by performing his or her own study. So there is this assumption that there is actually a gap in the knowledge. Sometimes the research question is also said to be the objective or the aim of the study. This actually informs the specific aim section of the NIH grant application. It forms the foundation of the study, and it's actually action-oriented, meaning the research should lead to answering a specific question. I'm going to pose this question. Is life worth living? Do you think this is a research question? And then why would you say it is not a research question?
Because it's not specific.
Specific enough? Anyone else want to venture why we would not consider this as a research question? That mentioned it's not specific enough. You can't say that, so you may have a hypothesis, but you will not be able to actually make an intervention and then actually measure. And then the other thing is, other aspects as we also will see. This is a very interesting and important question. So the importance of a question and the research question, we have to make a distinction. This is actually, I would argue, is a philosophical question, and it's a life and death question, right? but it's not available to a research investigation. So we have I'm using this absurd illustration to show even if you see research question research applications, sometimes if you actually read through them, you'll not be able to actually identify the research question in those studies. So I'm actually using the very extreme example, but you will be able to see that. Another way of looking at a research question is saying this is actually a boundary between what is currently known and what is ignorance. So we're actually trying to bridge that gap. So we can say there are researchable questions and there are questions that we may not be able to answer. So why do we need to frame a research question? So the challenge in finding a research question is defining an important one that can be transformed into a feasible and valid study plan. So we're starting, and this actually forms the basis of the study plan. Conceptually, what I would say is, so we have, somebody may have a research interest in some aspect, and then somebody refines that to a specific research question, and then based on that, you develop a study plan, and then you develop or design a study and implement it. So there are these three processes. Developing a research question is a critical aspect of the study plan, which is otherwise also known as the anatomy of the research, which consists of the research question, background and significance, design of the study, selection of subjects, and variables, important variables. So in this webinar, we're focusing on analytical kinds of research, where we're looking at the relationship between an exposure and an outcome, or an intervention and an outcome. So we have predictor variables, outcome variables, and other measurements, which are called confounding variables. And then there's also the statistical issue, including determination of sample size or power, and then hypothesis and the statistical analysis plan. So if somebody does not, so you'll see this study plan sometimes translated into a study protocol, which is a very important process when somebody is trying to apply for IRB approval and subsequently for a grant application. So it's very critical. And I'd like to make the point that this is actually writing the researchable question is one of the challenging and difficult step in the research process. It seems very easy, but I would argue that it's actually a very iterative process that should take a lot of time. Even if it is probably a one sentence, And then even when you're actually developing the study outline, it is a very important aspect. And probably Dr. Yolanda will give us examples. Like, seasoned investigators like Dr. Yolanda may find it easier, but novice investigators like us, like, it takes a while because you have to understand like what is like actually the scholarship in that field, and then you have to drill down like first to uh, amenable pieces that are manageable to implement in a study. A clear and carefully and thoughtfully constructed research question helps guide the research project to its scholarly target. I think one reason most of research questions actually may not contribute to a generalized knowledge is because they may not have been framed appropriately or validly. And some people make the claim that research is only as good as the research question and plan on which it's based. It's the same thing like anything in life. If you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. So definitely from the outset, actually the research plan is going to fail. So it's like a blueprint on which everything is tied to. But it's not the only aspect, but it's a very important aspect. The other thing, especially for junior investigators, is making a distinction between a research interest and a research question. A research interest is very broad, and most of us actually, like graduates, would actually struggle to come up with a research question, and most of us end up like uh, tagging along or piggybacking on our mentors' research projects. And our research interests, like we actually get confused. Okay, I'm interested, like I'm a Norwegian, but I'm interested, like hyperemissive or gravidan because I've seen this patient or I read this interesting paper, but it may not be like well formed. But so research interest is relatively very broad, so we have to make that distinction. As a distraction, I'm posting. Go ahead. Okay. There is this is a distraction. There is a paper by, I don't know how to pronounce his name. He's a Greek name. Ioannidis. He's a guy actually who does not do a lot of primary research, a lot of staff work. He actually looks at other people's research and makes a lot of critics about them. And he has this famous paper published in the PLOS one that says why most published research findings are false. So I'm gonna quote what he said. For many current scientific field, climate research findings often may be simply accurate measures of the prevailing bias. And he actually, mentions different aspects, starting from, the valid, how poorly, frame research questions are actually forwarded, and they're also, designed poorly, and then they make poor conclusions, but they get published. When he talks about actually clinical research, he's even including clinical trials, which is actually very nerve-wracking. I mean, it's they actually have done a lot of modeling exercise where they actually have noticed this. So by illustrating all this, it's actually reassuring for junior investigators to understand that most findings are false. So meaning if you actually work hard on drilling down your research question, you may be a really good investigator. So it's for society it's scary. For junior investigators, I mean, highlighting this is will make hopefully the research endeavor more more useful. So somebody may start with a very general research topic, and then later on focus down to a specific question and develop hypotheses and specific aims. Another area I would like to cover is where do you find actually a research question from? The obvious thing, maybe for practitioners, OB-GYNs and midwifery faculty and practitioners, your observations in your clinical practice actually may help bring up those questions. Maybe you have seen, in medicine, some people say 20%, only around 20% of the practice is actually backed up by evidence. So there is actually a lot of unknowns. So it may be just dogma or so-called expert opinion. So so that may be like a starting point for thinking about your research question. Another thing is if you're doing quality improvement activities in your facilities, in your hospital, that also relate to coming up with a research question. Colleagues, and then scientific conferences definitely are one way of gathering research questions, and the scientific literature. Something we can't discount the importance of knowing your area or your field, because that's actually how you know the gap in the evidence base, or whether it's therapeutic, diagnostic, prognostic stuff. So that's very important. And there is also God has given everyone the imagination. So I mean, you can imagine any kind of study questions. I mean, it may be there may be a question about feasibility, but that's also one of the things. I'm leaving the last one, which is mentors. Dr. Yolanda has done a webinar on mentorship. It's actually a very important, aspect of coming up with the research question, because your mentors, understand, in your area, understand the lay of the land in terms of what is actually lacking in evidence and what's going to be interesting, which we'll be talking about. So some people argue actually one of the most important things you could do to advance your research career is, definitely lack in terms of getting a mentor. So it's a big investment, and a lot of people say, successful researchers say, if I have succeeded, it's because, I'm standing on the shoulder of giants. It's definitely so. That is a very important aspect, not only in helping you advance your career, even in starting you on your first research question. What are some of the characteristics of a good research question? So I'm using this framework, this book. So Hailey and colleagues have written this book based on their training at UCSF over 30 years, and they've come up with this criteria called the final criteria to help investigators identify what is a good clinical research question. So final stands for the feasible. So the research, so they're arguing that the research question should be feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant. And we'll go through some of these aspects. So feasible means you have to have, in order to be able to make appropriate assessment, you have to have adequate number of study subjects. If a study has very few sample size, your conclusions may be not erroneous, but you will have a lack in precision. So that lack of precision, which is actually a very low powered study, may not contribute to the generalized knowledge. I mean, some people make the argument that this could be combined in a meta-analysis, even if you have few patients, but it's going to create a lot of issues when you're actually trying to pull different kinds of studies. I mean, there is going to be heterogeneity. So that's a very important aspect of the research question. And so feasible, as you can see, is actually attached with the last aspect, which I mentioned, is adequate funding. Of course, you can't have access to unlimited funding. So that will limit the number of study subjects that you're going to have in your own study. But based on support from your biostatisticians, they'll help you determine, what would be an appropriate sample size for your specific question. So that's actually a very important thing. The other important aspect is it has to have the appropriate mix and match of technical experts in your field. So I would argue that research endeavor is not actually a one-man show. You need to have collaborators, and the research if the research question, however exciting it may seem, if it is not taking into account the technical expertise, is actually again, like we said, it's gonna you're actually planning to fail from the outset, and it has to be within the scope. So the other aspect is interesting. It has to be interesting. And this parameter actually, is saying that, it has to be interesting enough to actually provide the necessary motivation and intensity of effort for the research process. Research is, I don't know of anyone who says conducting research is easy. It's a huge endeavor, but it's albeit like a very rewarding one, like sometimes, hopefully most of the time. So, so unless somebody is actually interested in the research question, it is not going to go very good to the level of publication. And I mentioned an example, from myself and colleagues, some of us actually take mentors research question which we don't find interesting, and we just struggle with it. So we have to find it interesting to start with. So, and not only has to be interesting to yourself, but it has to be also interesting to other people, including mentors, outside experts, and sometimes if it is an applied kind of research, it has to be interesting to the public. If it is in healthcare, it has to be interesting to researchers and the society at large. So it has to it has to be interesting. It's a very important aspect. Another aspect is it has to be novel. A good research question contributes. That means a good clinical research contributes to new knowledge. By innovation, it doesn't mean it has to be totally original, but at least some of the concepts have to be different from other studies that were done in the previous times. So it may be this the newness may be in terms of concepts that the investigator is using, the methods or the approach, or the kind of interventions that the investigator is proposing. Sometimes you may do sort of what looks like a repeat study, but we may be using a different population, but that actually contributes to a generalized knowledge. So if you're using if somebody was a study was done in the US and somebody is actually doing a replication study in Ethiopia or Rwanda, it may make sense if there is an argument that there is actually a biological difference between the two. We've noted research questions saying, okay, the determinants of use of LARC in Awasa and another in Gondar, I'm sure we can actually use our imagination better than coming up with this kind of repeat kind of questions. I mean, we can come up with a different way of measuring, for example, let's say even in LARC determination, we may have a different conceptual framework that we can actually introduce. That actually contributes to the generalized knowledge that actually goes beyond Ethiopia and Rwanda or society at large. And the other aspect is ethical. The other aspects may not be necessary, but I would say this is actually a very necessary thing. The research question somebody is proposing should be ethical. So one of the first requirements of an ethical research is the research question must be worth asking. It must have the potential social, scientific, or clinical value. Some people make maybe the Minister of Health may not find the question very interesting, but because it's not applied, but it may sometimes pure science. I mean, advances knowledge. So if it has some scientific merit, that that may derive it. But when you're proposing a research question, if you actually anticipate there may be unacceptable levels of risk and or invasion of privacy, you have to look for other ways of answering the research question. And of course, there is actually based on what happened in the Second World War, there are actually regulatory bodies that are actually trying to make sure that the ethical aspects of research is actually arbitrary. So talking actually even at the earlier stage, before you even start proposing a Eurosport, sometimes if you have some uncertainties about the ethical nature of your study, you can actually talk to your IRB representatives very early on. And the next argument I'm gonna make is validity, is an essential element of ethical research. So It may seem not very intuitive, like, validity and ethical, but you'll see the connection. So, um, because a poorly designed research, because validity means the research question is answering what is supposed to be answered. So there may be, like, if you remember in some of your background uh, um, classes about validity, like, they may have two aspects, like, let's say accuracy and precision. Accuracy measuring what's supposed to be measuring, reliability, replication, or reproducibility. So if if a study is actually poorly designed, meaning it's actually not bringing, like, valid answers, valid, we're saying that, um, valid, like, if it's a poorly designed research, let's say examples maybe like inappropriate design for the study question, inadequately powered, like we mentioned with low powered studies, or insufficient or sloppy data, bad science, inappropriate or antecedent methods. It's actually going to be very harmful because we're not dealing with potatoes here. We're dealing with human subjects, so it's actually going to be harmful because human and material resources are wasted. Individuals are exposed to risks for no benefit. So it is a critical element, and it's not like, people are not trying to make it hard. Like IRBs are not trying to make it hard by requiring, like, your study is actually well designed. It's from the design space. It's because it has an association with the ethics of it. So respect for persons. Belmont, you remember Belmont principle. So that's very important. The other aspect is relevant, or sometimes, like, we can talk about significance. That means, I mean, it may be very interesting, but it has to have some benefit, like, some importance. Like the problem has to be of some importance to the scientific field in general or the society. And, like, for example, this is actually one aspect in an NIH grant application, like significance, writing up the significance section. So we have to determine, like, how the project will improve scientific knowledge or will change, like, how the results will change concept, methods, clinical practice, policies, or even, like, refute, like earlier on, or even confirm like theories that were actually not, like, empirical previously. So we've talked about some of the characteristics, but another aspect that may, like, so these are very artificial. So I'd grant that, these are helpful frameworks. They're not, like, dogmas that we have to follow. And not every kind of research question is actually amenable to such kind of investigation. So we're not covering, like, for example, qualitative research. And, like, of course, there are some elements of that we can actually use in, like, critiquing whether that research question is finer, like fine-tuned, but it may not be available. But we also have to understand this so what question. It has, like, every study, like I would argue, like every study question, research question should have passed the so what test. What does that mean? It means, like, will the research make a difference? To be honest, if it's not gonna make a difference, why waste resources? Why um, um, expose subjects to unnecessary risk? I mean, I would not, there is, like, no research is risk free, especially clinical research. So we have to really think, will this make a difference? So now we talked about the characteristics. So how that, like, we need to get, like, a helpful thing, because I started, like, lamenting about, okay, most research is, like, that's contributor even if it's published, and we have this criteria. We have to bring it down to this and say, okay, what would be a useful framework to help me, like, I have this big, like, research question, like, research idea. How do I finally and distill it to come up with a good research question? So there is this framework called the PICOT framework. I think it was developed by, the developers of the evidence-based medicine out of McMaster. So they have what's called the PICOT framework. This actually comes from usually from clinical trials, but there are some aspects, and there are other, like, different versions. But I'm just using it as a framework, so we'll just do it in this one. In order to develop any kind of research ideas, there are other, like, apart from even, like, the people, there are other like, frameworks or approaches like mind mapping, brainstorming. Definitely, these are important things. Focus group. That's actually why we use boards to actually come up with digital questions. So these are important. But this has been demonstrated. The PICOT approach has been demonstrated to actually help, especially clinical settings, especially clinical. So what is P stands for population. So I'm gonna use initially the initial one, but then we can have other versions. So population, intervention, comparison or comparator, outcome, and time frame. So there is actually a funny story about the T part. I would not talk about it. I would direct to the original article by Brian Haynes, why they actually start using the term because people has some meaning in Spanish. They found out when they were actually teaching in Peru. So, but it's actually a useful one. So there is so they add the Pico initially, that they added the T later on. And Yolanda probably knows what it means. It has
Maybe there's some bad words.
Yes, yes. So yeah, and then the other values are population. We can talk about patient or problem. So I mean, we have to put this in a certain context. So the question maybe about diabetes, contraception. That's a kind of, and then the intervention. So the intervention, this is not this may not be relevant for observational studies, for example, but because instead of intervention we use exposure. So it depends on the kind of question you're looking at. If it is etiological, trying to find out about the causative agent, it's not going to be intervention. It may be about exposure. It may be about diagnostic tests or prognostic factors. And then a comparator. Usually, especially this is actually very helpful for making causal inferences, especially in analytical studies, but it may not be relevant to most studies. And definitely outcome should be there. If an outcome is not explicitly defined, I mean, it's not going to be a very good research. And then time frame. You can't have a research endeavor that actually continues to eternity, right? It has to have an end. So not only for pragmatic reasons. I'll try to illustrate this using an example from a different field. Because I mean, the reason being some of them are actually applied to different research questions, but we'll talk about exercises that we can actually do at home. So the original question, let's say, is what is the best way to prevent and manage spasticity in TBI patients? This is actually traumatic brain injury patients. This is from the field of these are examples I found from a paper. So I think we can spend a couple of minutes talking about this, and I will need people's contribution. Why they don't think this question is is not formatted in a pre-code format, and why you don't think it actually illustrates what are good aspects of research. So how the researchers actually converted this relatively broad and vague question. So they said in patients with severe TBI, so that means this actually identifying the population. So we're actually looking at even from traumatic brain injury patients, specifically looking at this group, severe TBI. What is the effect of casting on spasticity? So the outcome they're looking at now is spasticity. And then they have a comparator, compare with pharmacological management. So casting versus, so there is actually that comparison. For the sake of time, I'll also go over the other ones. The other question they had was, why should we fund physiotherapy for patients following discharge from rehab? So I'm actually using different kinds of questions. I'm citing different kinds of questions to say not all questions are therapeutic questions. Some are diagnostic. You can have a health service research. You can have a question about finances. So this may be very appealing to funders, right? Why would they'll be interested? Why? So they've converted this into say in patients following rehab. Why? This is in patients following CI. So this is actually a specific group. What is the effect of community-based physiotherapy? So this is the intervention. on functional status, the outcome, compared with standard care, the comparator. So in all of this, they're actually this group is actually using the PICO format, not the PICO format. The last one is, why did you do? This is actually a colleague asking another person. Why did you do a CT, or like you're attending? Why did you do a CT instead of an MRI for this patient? So Yolanda may be asking her fellow a question like that. Or the reverse, maybe Yolanda's question may be like, because she is in leadership, she wants to reduce finances. She would say, why would you do an MRI instead of a CT scan, right? Assuming CT scan is actually cheaper, right? So that question is relatively vague. So it's just converted into in patients with suspected TBI, what is the diagnostic value of CT? So this is actually a diagnostic compared with MRI. So it's very easy, like, you can actually see the progression. Another example is from our paper, actually. So we wanted to actually, like, I was like afraid, like, maybe we have not been very explicit, like, in like, actually, like, mentioning the research question, because sometimes that happens. And this is not a secret. You can actually find, like, in most research papers, you find the research question probably in the last paragraph. Maybe Dr. Aylanda can help us. Is that true? Like, last paragraph was the introduction or background. So here, for example, we say the objective of the study was to assess if structured. So now actually we haven't, like, we can actually critique it. So the objective of the study is to assess if structured integration of comprehensive family training into a medical school curriculum improves family planning knowledge and skills of interest. So I'll stop here. So based on that criteria, it was like, if you use PICO, would you identify the population here? I'm actually asking, like, this is a population from okay, so interest. Okay, integration. What is the intervention? Is the intervention explicit? Structured integration. Excellent. Into curriculum. And then do you have a comparison? It's not explicit. It's not explicit. Maybe we'll see it in the hypothesis, but I'm just stopping there. How about so outcome? What is the outcome?
Improving
knowledge. Perfect. So we don't have like a time horizon listed here, but then, like, sometimes combined. So it's a little bit semantics. I mean, like, not semantics. So hypothesis also, like, is actually leading to the study objective. So, but if you look at the hypothesis, we hypothesize that interest from the intervention site with the structured integrated curriculum. So the intervention is have higher knowledge and skills compared to sport control site. So the control group is now apparent when you're actually stating hypothesis. And I would ask Dr. Yolanda's advice. I think it seems very, like, prudent, to be honest, like, as much as possible to try to, it's just a few words. I don't know if the reviewers actually would fight over this, like, to state your hypothesis. If you have a hypothesis, to be very explicit. What do you think? Like, because sometimes it may not be apparent if you're looking at analytic studies.
Yeah, I think people like to see hypothesis-driven research. And so you have a hypothesis, you're best off stating
it. So I heard this from this thing from a management group about, like, he says, like, think on paper. Like, it has to be like, think on paper. Sometimes you actually think about, like, I know that my hypothesis, but, like, write it there. So that may be a helpful tip. So we're wrapping up. So I'm, like, posting, like, I was actually trying to find very good research questions. So I stumbled upon this website. So I'm gonna share this with you. So the NIH actually has very useful resources. So I went directly to there's actually a project, like, a branch called Contraception Research Branch of the National. His name is Kennedy Shriver, National Institute of Child Health and Human Development that Yolanda and her colleagues actually usually maybe applying to, like, because there are different institutes. So from that, like, institute, there is this branch that's actually like totally focused on contraception research branch. So, and it's interestingly, I'm giving this away. They actually had, like, some faculty, support some of the research questions I've looked at actually were collaborations between some institutions in the US and I remember South Africa, India, and Uganda. So I looked at all the research that was funded from 2008 2019, and I tried to see if because we know these are good research questions. We're assuming they are good because they are funded. Mm-hmm. So that's actually my assumption. And so, but you can test that. So one question, because I one question I looked at was because we know how actually were involved in is hello? So one question is assessing pregnancy with intrauterine devices for emergency contraception. This is a broad topic, so I'm picking the specific aim that they have. It says our primary aim is to assess the efficacy of LNG20 IUD versus the copper IUD for emergency contraception, utilizing non-inferiority design, assessing the feasibility and acceptability of using the home urinary LH test kits to detect ovulation in exclusively breastfeeding women. This is in the realm of Yolanda, so she can actually tell us a little bit about that. Yeah.
This one?
Yeah.
That's a hard. Non-inferiority designs are hard. They have to be very large trials.
Mm-hmm.
Urinary LH.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. So based on the people, outside of some of them, apart. Because I'm granted, I'm actually picking a piece of it. So, of course, if you look at the whole grant, this is a summary I find from the report.
So they have the comparison, they have breastfeeding women, they have the outcome being that they are equal.
Mm-hmm.
So it looks like a good question. It's interesting that they have the acceptability of home LH kits to detect ovulation. I'm not sure how that.
So I think some of the design. So in this one, the ones I looked at, some actually they actually include the methodology and the approach in the even in in the statements. Yeah, this is too granular, right? Too specific. Do you think was it too specific or what?
Well, it's like two things that.
Okay, two questions.
There's a comparison between.
About the efficacy. That was one question
about the progestin IUD and the copper IUD.
Mm-hmm.
Emergency contraception.
So this is one study question.
Right. So that's one thing.
And then they're looking at this.
Those are equal for emergency contraception, and the other thing they're looking at is using those home ovulation kits to detect ovulation.
Yeah, but they are also trying to. This is actually a test in feasibility and acceptability. So it's a different question.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's two questions in one.
Yeah, that's confusing. Exactly. But even fundamental research. So now, I mean, we can pick. The good thing is we can pick any kind of research question. No question is perfect. So that's at least that doesn't make us only the only people. So it is always one of the good qualities of a researcher is actually able to change the research questions and modify them, not totally married to whatever you've written up. So another one. So for the sake of time, I'm actually not going to go over the other ones. But there was one question I wanted to see. Yeah, this was actually because we know the person Alice Edelman. So she was looking at this seems relatively clean question. Improving emergency. So the overall goal was improving emergency contraceptive effectiveness in obese women. So they actually state the hypothesis. We hypothesize that increasing the dose of orally dosed emergency consultative agents will normalize the pharmacokinetic results in the export treatment effect in obese women. So this is actually a pharmacokinetic study, but this is relatively clear, I would say. So, so I'm actually going to be summarizing. So, research question begins with an idea, right? And then funnels and transform. So I would like to also have on the transformation. It is this transformation has to happen from a big research idea to a research question. And it has to be clear, focused, and concise. And it has to be expressed in simple, straightforward language. As we've seen, sometimes it's actually not even apparent in funded research. And a lot of people, veteran, the seasoned researchers say that, we can actually write just one statement, in one sentence. Question. So again, going back to say because let's say ideally this is actually $1 million research project. Before you embark on doing that, the same thing you're building a Titanic, you have to, or a Boeing 767. You actually, you actually have to think but I mean it looks very funny, but it's really true. You have to think about design. Some people try to salvage a research project by doing different implementation strategies or statistical analysis. I'd like to say this thing: no amount of statistical sophistication would salvage a poorly designed study. So think before embarking on this is a huge thing. Anything video planning, think about that. So that's actually my whole point is think about your research question, talk with your colleagues, make sure it's actually design. And the other important point I want to mention is it's an iterative process. You're not gonna get it right the first time you're trying it, so that's fine. You have to do it again and again and modify it. I remember for my project, I was actually very frustrated. My mentor told me you have to write a 1-page study plan, and it took me 4 months. And I was but I have just write a 1-page. But that exercise actually helped me narrow it down. So it's not a futile exercise. So I'm not gonna leave you alone without giving you exercises to do at home. So I suggest go whenever you get time, look for research papers in your area of interest. I'm sure you're gonna get a lot of them. Don't tell me this is not open access. There are a lot of open access articles you can actually have access to. Then go and look at if the research question is explicitly stated. So Dr. Yolanda has given us the tip. Go to the last paragraph of the research, in the introduction or background, and find out if the research question is, number one, explicitly stated, and use the final criteria and the Picot framework to critique the merits of the research question. And the next thing I'd say is, why don't you start continue working, writing your ideal research question. I didn't say think about. I said write your ideal research question. When I say ideal, so from the final, I'm removing the F part for you, the feasibility side. Think you have unlimited resources and you have all the expertise. And then use the final question to refine the question. So it may be very ambitious, narrow it down so that now you actually take into consideration feasibility. And don't keep it to yourself. Share it with your colleagues and mentors so that they can critique. Have a very thick skin. Don't get I like it when Yolanda is actually using her red pen. So this is a very important thing. Track change. So that's actually good. And the other thing is the same thing I did. Go to the NIH report website. It's open access to find funded research projects because that's actually a good, provide a good metric for what a good research question is to help you, number one, narrow down your search so that you will not repeat this after. So in terms of resources, I would advise you to go to the Research Guide website and the NIH website.
Your slides will be available.
Yes, I'm gonna share them with some information. Thank you so much for bearing with me. I was actually all over the place, but I hope at least I made the point. Research question is not easy, but important and it's doable. And hopefully we also try to demystify like, the research endeavor, like, it is by saying that, okay, I can think like, questions, even like, life and days questions like them, like, and then convert them. So your limit is only your imagination. And so thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
I just wanted to add for everybody that we know that research is really exciting to do and can really advance the field. It's also something that takes a lot of work. So I encourage everybody to think about what area you want to make a difference in, where you see patients suffering, and where you want to put your energy, and to really look for research questions in areas that you're really passionate about, areas that really, really speak to you. So I think those are the areas that you will be the most imaginative about, and that you will probably be the most excited about exploring the literature, and will probably come up with the best questions. So look for your passion when you're looking for research questions. And I just want to say that what I was told by my mentor when I was looking for, my early research questions was to really pay attention when I'm reading a paper or I'm at a meeting listening to a presentation and people use the phrases like, we found this interesting connection, but we really don't know what this means, or this is going on, but we don't have any answers to this kind of question. To really have my antenna up when I hear, we don't know what this means, we don't know what this connection is, we don't have an answer for this. To really just pay attention to those things when I'm listening to talks in my area, or when I'm reading papers in my area, because that may be areas that I might be interested in exploring, or at least that will really show me where the cutting edge is when I'm reading and hearing those presentations. So I just kind of want to throw that out there. And then just on a practical basis, when you're working on your iterative process, I just wanted to say that one of my mentors also taught me that you work as hard as you can with all these the PICO techniques and everything to get the best question you can. And then the next thing you do is you say, okay, with this question, the design I would need to answer this question is, whatever it is, it's a comparison, it's a clinical trial, it's a longitudinal study, whatever it is, and then you talk with somebody and you figure out what your sample size would be to answer that question, and that's your feasibility right there. Could I do this study in the time frame I have with the sample size I need? Because if you can't, then you have to go back to your question and re-ask it so that it can be in a design and a sample size that would work for you. So right there, before you do any further writing, is where you stop and make sure you have a design and a sample size that can answer the question that you had just worked on before you do anything else. That was the other thing my mentor taught me, which was really helpful for saving lots of time and making sure I came up with the right question.
I think if anybody does have any questions moving forward, I know that reaching out to me or to Berhanu or Yolanda, I'm not sure, I'm always available to help direct the questions. So please don't hesitate to contact us in the future. All right, thank you all so much. Berhanu, any last words?
Thank you. Amasaganari. Murakuzi. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.